Dear guests, we are ready to start. Please take your seat. We will be starting within 2 minutes.
Волонтеры прикрывают дверь, распределяются по залу. Проследите, пожалуйста, чтобы у всех... Рабочие языки сессии: русский, английский, французский.
Working languages are Russian, English, and French.
И апдейт по Алексею Александровичу. Где он? Андрей Александрович. Вчера. Вот, Андрей Александрович. Уважаемые гости.
Dear guests, on behalf of the management of the HSC and my own behalf, I'm happy to welcome you to the 24th Annual Yasin-April International Academic Conference on Development of the Economy and Society. The total number of participants is up to 2,000 people, attendees. We're happy that we are having here the plenary session in Africa in the second day. Africa is not only a continent rich in natural resources. And amidst the fourth industrial revolution, the number one asset is people. And the African region is no doubt rich in human capital. The greatest share of younger generation in the world is in Africa. At the turn of the century, we've been watching transition of the core of the world economy and politics into Asia. And during 21st century, it is Africa that is going to become the fastest growing region demographically, economically, and politically. At the same time, in the 21st century, Africa will be the most tumultuous continent because countries of this region are still in the process of modernization, urbanization, formation of ethno-political nations, and state development, and quite often in their initial phases. This, in its turn, demands in-depth understanding of the logic and regularities and patterns of social or political, cultural, economic development of African countries amidst changing environment. It's also important to discuss the enhanced significance and building strong links between the peoples and economies of Russia and African countries. It's known that throughout its history, interaction between Russian and African countries was based on the pillars of mutual respect, for culture, traditions, interests of each other, on building current equitable partnership relations and launching projects for mutually beneficial cooperation. I will be moderating this, and I'm happy to welcome the attendees to HSC. Dear speakers, please keep to 5 to 7 time limit. When you get closer to this, we'll signal you that it's time to come to the conclusions. Let me give the floor to the first speaker today, This is Barbara Wadzi, Deputy Minister of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality of the Republic of Zimbabwe. During the elections of 2018, she was a candidate to deputy from ZANU-PF political party, the ruling party, was the only woman MP of the party that succeeded and who succeeded in the primary elections of the ruling party in 2018. She represented Zimbabwe in the Pan-African Parliament. In June 2021, she joined her colleagues from South Africa calling for rotation of the leadership based on the rules of the African Union. You are welcome. Ms. Barbara Wadzi.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. As mentioned, my name is Barbara Wadzi from Zimbabwe, MP from the Midlands province. I was actually the only woman in the province, not in the whole country. Let me correct that. All protocol observed. Dear colleagues, the Russia and Africa relationship backdates to the colonial era, when Russia played a very pivotal role in the liberation of African countries, most of the African countries, from colonial rule. Russia supported African countries through political and military training. In my country, specifically Zimbabwe, Russia has been an all-weather friend. From the liberation war fighters who were trained in this country, most of them spending about 5 years training in Russia, and that back from the 60s to the 70s, and even beyond in the 80s. Russia supported Zimbabwe in the reconstruction and the post-independent Zimbabwe through technical and human capital development. Until today, we have people of Zimbabwe in various colleges and universities in Russia being trained here, and we are grateful and forever grateful about that. Human capital that understands the capacities and peculiar context of the two countries is critical in enhancing the relationship. Honorable colleagues, we take note and we appreciate all this work that has been done between our two countries. However, the shift in global governance has opened doors for emerging economies and created room for their intergovernmental cooperation. This has spurred a departure from the previous East-West global division towards a new North-South era. The diplomatic novelty of the BRICS is substantive, and all that the geography of power is deconcentrating southward from the north. Russia has proven over the years that it is possible to break the template of democracy and governance from the imposing force of Western idealism. To this end, our self-defined claim to governance remains underpinned and unpinned on preservation of national sovereignty. Colleagues, sovereignty remains a key global value which, in the case of Africa, had long been undermined by intrusion of external power. The African Renaissance, led by former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, pursued ownership of continent's development agenda and police autonomy, and challenged West domination in the affairs of the continent. Going back to my country in Zimbabwe, our president for the new dispensation since 2017, His Excellency Emmerson Damzo Mnangagwa, has continued to direct Zimbabwe towards a sustainable path of engagement and re-engagement, with a view to get Zimbabwe's lost share of financial stability as a result of economical illegal sanctions. As you are all aware, that our country has been under illegal sanctions imposed by the West for over 20 years now. We remain indebted to Russia for standing by our side, even to an extent of voting against the resolution of UN Security Council for the invasion of Zimbabwe at the peak of our land reform. We cannot ignore the fact that the world around is changing rapidly. The global landscape is shifting in ways that are both exciting and challenging, particularly for countries like us who are under sanctions. And in the midst of all this change, Africa finds itself at a crossroads. The first Russia-Africa summit held in October 2019 in Sochi was very productive and noticeably had good ties between Russia and African states. The summit catapulted all our commercial and cultural diplomas. The partnership between Russia and African countries has gained additional momentum and is reaffirming the strength of our solidarity. And I'll speak about my country. We are really reaffirming our solidarity with Russia, and we are forever grateful. As we prepare for the second Russia-Africa Summit, scheduled to take place from 26 to 29 July 2023 in St. Petersburg, the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, highlighted that Russia has always given and will continue to give priority to cooperation with African states. He further added that Russia is determined to continue building a full strategic partnerships with African countries and is ready to shape global agenda towards sustainable development. Again, since signing the world's largest free trade zone, to which Zimbabwe is a stakeholder, Africa is progressively securing its seat at the top of the table. Likewise, Africa plays a crucial role in global governance systems and that seek to reduce inequalities and bring about global stability. For far too long, Africa has relegated to the margins of the global economy and global politics. Africa is a continent, as mentioned before, with vibrant cultures, with rich history, with heritage of the incredible natural resources, and some of the most talented and resilient, hardworking people. It has the highest number of the young people that are coming up, and hence a good human capital resource. Herein lies the prospects of the future. As the world changes, Africa has an opportunity to take its rightful place on the global stage. We have the chance to seize this moment and build a brighter future for ourselves as Africa and also together with the rest of the world. We must also recognize that Africa has many strengths and assets that we can build on together with the world. We have a young and dynamic population that is hungry for opportunities and very eager to make its mark on the world. We have a wealth of natural resources that includes oil and gas to minerals, and agriculture can be harnessed for the benefit of our people. We also have a rich cultural heritage, as mentioned before, that can inspire and uplift us. We strive for the better future. Back to Zimbabwe. We are focusing more on our relationship with Russia, on the MOUs that have already been signed, particularly with the Higher and Tertiary Education Ministry, that brings in innovation. We have a number of MOUs that have been signed, and we would want to continue riding on that as it brings technology and innovation that is cutting across the world, and we ride on our relationship with Russia. We cannot predict the future, but we can shape it. And we want to shape it with those that believe in us as a country, and Russia is one of those. So our doors are open. Let's continue with the relationship, and we want to be on the same scale with the rest of the world and the rest of our continent. As we stand at this crossroads, let us choose the path of hope and progress, and let us choose the path that leads to a brighter future for Africa in this and changing the whole world. So together we stand. I thank you.
Dear Ms. Wadzi, thank you very much for your presentation. Your experience in public administration and active social and political stance are important for our discussion about the future of the region. This is very important. And now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Sisula Lindiwa, Minister of Tourism and of the Republic of South Africa from 2014 to 2023, member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. She previously served as Minister of Housing, Minister of Defense and Veterans of the Armed Forces, Minister of Public Service and Administration, Minister of Human Settlements, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Minister of Human Settlements, Water and Sanitation, Minister of Tourism. I'm just wondering what is going to be your next position in your ministry. Ms. Sisulu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be in Moscow today, once again, invited to address this August gathering on the 24th International Academic Conference on Economic and Social Development, convened by the prestigious Higher School of Economics, and share the podium with esteemed panelists such as we have. If you'll permit me, I'd like to thank Professor Alexander Shokin, President of the HSC, and Dr. Nikita Anisimov, Rector and Chairperson of the Organizing Committee, members of the HSC Council, all members present here today, and my dearest friend, Comrade Shubin, who is a legendary figure in our struggle. I've been asked to offer my perspective of Africa in a changing world. The world around us is changing. It is changing in ways we haven't experienced in generations. And as the world changes, so does Africa change with it. The new emerging international order will not resemble the balance of political, economic, and military power we have known. The pace and direction of these changes is still unfolding in the current turbulence. But what is certain, the era ahead of us will result in a new order and seismic changes to global institutions and rules. And Africa's influence and role in defining this new order will be more significant than at any other time because Africa's place in the world has changed. The trajectory of Africa's history to this point could have been different. Its influence on the world and on the changes could have been far greater, except for significant events in the past. Significant events in the past go back to a time when Rome was at war on one hand with Carthage, because these were two superpowers. Over 2,000 years ago, this is when the great military leaders in history almost destroyed Rome. Hannibal, a daring African general, came from the city of Carthage, led an army of warriors and battle elephants over the snowy Alps to invade the very heart of Rome's growing empire. As a commander in war, Hannibal has few equals in history and has long been held as a model of strategic and tactical genius. But Hannibal was much more than that. He was a great African general. He was a practiced statesman, a skilled diplomat, and a man deeply devoted to his country and a continent. The Romans, on the other side, defined Europe. They set the precursors for its current geographic boundaries, language and differences, and even its major religions and systems of government. But all this could have been different. Founded in the 6th century, one could consider Carthage as Rome's complete antithesis. Whereas Carthage built its empire on trade, Rome expanded by conquest and plunder. Carthaginians, who were Africans in origin, preferred establishing colonies that retained their national identities in exchange for annual tribute, whereas on the other hand, Rome opted for the assimilation and alienation of conquered lands and encouraged a singular Roman identity. This permeated throughout the European culture. But what would Europe be like if Hannibal of Carthage, of African origin, had won over Rome? Just want you to consider that. Just that one war decided the fate of all of us in this world. At its peak prior to European colonialism, it is estimated that Africa had up to 10,000 different states, autonomous groups with distinct languages and customs. This was before the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 that established the rules for the conquest and partitioning of Africa, because for them, this was the spoils of war. They had a right, legitimizing the brutal exploitation of Africa and Africans as the property of the Europeans and the United States, and resolutely refusing to consider the question of our sovereignty. 135 years after the Berlin began and after our own colonization, we decided that perhaps we needed to do something as the African continent. It was a defining moment for us. African states met in Addis Ababa, 32 of them, in Ethiopia on the 1st of May in 1964 to found the Organization of African Union. The momentum of Africa's unity drive continued and consolidated. 26 years after Addis Ababa, African leaders adopted the CERTA Declaration on the 9th of September 1999 and announced the formation of what we know today as the African Union. CERTA was followed by summits at Lome, Togo, etc., and a constitution of the African Union was adopted in Lusaka in 2001. The first session of the Assembly of the African Union was held in our country in Durban, and we were very proud to be the first place at which there was a formal sitting of the African Union. As Kwame Nkrumah put it, and I quote, "Our objective is African Union now. The struggle against colonialism does not end with attainment of national independence," unquote. What he meant is the struggle continues. The foundation of Pan-African unity is based on the idea of Pan-Africanism, an idea of process and movement to achieve Pan-African or all-African unity. Throughout its evolution, all-Africanism has been characterized by robust debates centered on the form and content of the ideas and its practice. What are our challenges going forward now? We need clear, bold, and strategic leadership, especially at political level, in order to do two things. One, to establish and utilize new institutional arrangements and to enhance and depend on our own existing institutions. Two, if Africa is to take itself seriously, then the All-Africa Unity Project is to be a lodestar for the development and the basis of relations with the rest of the world. Our countries must pursue a united position on issues that will affect Africa and address Africa's agenda to develop its economies and lift millions of citizens from poverty. Africa's position in the global politics is that the world is for itself and Africa will look after itself first. With the collapse of globalization, it has become evident that Africa must find its agency once more, just as it did in the fight against colonialism. Sovereignty, which is the ability to control internal economic development and enter into international market systems on one's own terms, a crucial prerequisite to economic development. It is a crucial principle underlying all of that which we stand for as the African Union. However, we have another platform that we meet as African states, and it is the Non-Aligned Movement. It is the most significant international movement emerging in contemporary history. The founding principle of NAM is anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. And because the standard platform for African countries with their international peers to put forward common agendas so that we are able to see eye to eye with those people who had colonized us and indicate to them that we are independent and what our needs are. Non-alignment today has become one of the dominant trends in international relations and politics. It represents the hopes, desires, aspirations of the overwhelming majority of the world population who suffer from colonialism, imperialism, racism, and neocolonialism. Africa aspires to a vision where it is open, integrated, stable, capable of trading fairly with the entire world, and politically autonomous. However, African agency in international affairs is exercised within the context of external constraints. Now, we have what we call the Washington Consensus that has been at the basis of our discussion in the African Union in a changing world. Africa's economic development and its path to integration was dealt a blow under the Washington Consensus that imposes market-based reforms prescribed by the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, but failed to improve the economic conditions of African countries because of their failure to account for political economy within their countries and politics of conditionality that are imposed on them, and reforms that did not adequately emphasize the role of local ownership and shaping domestic economic policies. Thereafter, we decided we're going to go on and consolidate African unity. With the collapse of globalization, it has become evident that Africa must find its unity once more, just as it did during the long, painful fight against colonialism. There must be a new urgency of purpose to extract Africa from economic and political servitude, a new resolve to take its identity into its own hands as an equal partner in the family of nations, all nations. Africa's people are restless for change. Its leaders sense this restlessness and need to respond to this. The positioning of Africa in the changing global politics is important for the world and for Africa itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I will postulate that Africa, as a unit of what I call Africa proper, has more to gain from entangling itself with the fortunes of China and Russia in the context of global power politics. We've chosen the right paths, and this is the path that we are following. Yet in matters of economics, Africa must engage all nations in bettering the lives of its restless citizens. This is a policy of political and economic realism, unfortunately. To conclude my presentation, I want to recall the words of the great African son, Kwame Nkrumah, and I quote, "It is clear that we must find an African solution to our problems, and that this can only be found in an African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good in the world," which is possibly why we have been supported by so many good people, because we have the potential to be one of the greatest in the world. Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand unto God, and Africa must unite. This is what we fight for on a daily basis. Right now, we have the prospect of having an important meeting in South Africa, BRICS meeting in South Africa, and following the announcement that BRICS would be held in South Africa, we're glad to find that so many people are now willing to join BRICS. It is a real achievement for us. We're working very hard to make sure that it is a success, because if we unite in this way with like-minded like-minded ideologies, and at the level at which we want to integrate into the world, we believe we can go forward. We want to make sure that we are put in the place that everybody else is in and ensure that Africa can play its part. We are very rich in minerals. We're very rich in so many things that the world needs, but it must be at our own determination. We welcome you, those who will be coming to BRICS. We will be waiting for you, and we will ensure that none of the drama that is going out in the newspapers happens. We look forward to a very consolidated BRICS because this is our way forward, and we believe in it. Thank you very much.
Благодарим вас, госпожа Сисулу, за столь интересное, важное выступление, отражающее ситуацию в Южной Африке, на континенте. И мне особенно приятно слышать о том, как развиваются отношения Южной Африки со странами БРИКС.
And it is especially delightful for me to hear from you everything that you've done in terms of uniting nations. That has been a very interesting and important presentation. And we're trying to continue working on that on various levels, and we would be happy to see you at the BRICS events in South Africa. And now I would like to present the next speaker, Alexei Mikhailovich Vasilyev, an honorary president of the Institute of Africa of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Professor Vasilyev has devoted his entire career to the study of the African region and has held various positions in government agencies working on the development of cooperation with African countries. And if I were to list all of your positions, we would never leave this place. Mr. Vasilyev, I'm happy to give you the floor and would be happy to hear your opinion about the future of the continent. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, usually we talk about the immediate future of the world and maybe medium-term forecasts. But in order to imagine the path down which the world is going, including the path Africa is taking, I would like to take a look into the more remote future. I would like to express the hope that mankind in the 2050 or maybe in the 2060s is looking at the major revolution in the history of mankind. The total size of the population of mankind will stop growing and will start shrinking. Maybe this will be good for the nature. It will not be good for Russia with its fairly low population, but the fact is more and more countries are being depopulated. They are losing population. That included Europe, Japan, South Korea. China has now joined that trend. Population growth rates are declining in many other countries, and by 2050 or 2060 the population of the Earth will stop growing. But the matter of the fact is that the only source of additional manpower and population will be Africa. And that would mean that every fourth citizen in the world, be that 9 or 10 billion people living on the planet, every fourth individual living on the planet will be an African. Some are saying that this would be a tragedy for the continent because you would need to feed all these people. But that said, if the needed amount of investment is made into the development of agriculture in Africa, in upgrading fertilizer production technologies, Africa could become self-sufficient after a while, but certain decisions would have to be taken for that to happen. Now, how will Africa's place in our world be changing as a result of this? Africa's development over the last 20 to 30 years had followed a general trend of global development, which was basically marked by the following. It was the non-Western world that was growing faster than the Western world as a whole, in terms of GDP and growth rates of that. And Africa is growing faster than the West, despite all of its challenges. And this trend will continue. The explosive development of China that turned into the number 2 power in the world, there's a similar event happening in India. It shows that the non-Western world will be playing an increasingly more important role in the multipolar world, including Africa, of course. If we are to talk about the prospects that open before Africa, one could assume that after a while the growth of population in Africa is going to flatten out, and this could probably take several dozen decades. And the more people are educated, the lower our birth rates, the less there are children in families, the longer people live, that the lower percentage will fall on those that are responsible for the growth of population and births. But this will not prevent Africa from becoming a new center of growth, a new economic giant that would at least be equal to that of the European Union. It will not happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but it will happen. And this will have an impact on various things in our lives. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Maybe it will not happen the day after tomorrow, but Africa is looking at hard times. There will be new coup d'etats, there will be new riots and unrest, and maybe there will be some conflicts between states and different ethnicities and religions, but this will not be showing that there is no future for Africa or that there is no prospect for future development.
I could deliberate on this for quite a long time. In the new multipolar world, Africa, particularly if it becomes more unified, enjoys greater unity, Africa will be elaborating and developing African solutions for the issues, not based on the previous stereotypes developed and imposed by the West. I observed after Africa gained independence, on the advice of the so-called Western partners, African industries were destroyed. Currently, when one sees population size decline in developed countries, there is a growing need for workforce. Workforce labor becomes more and more expensive in the West. Industries are moving to Africa first in primary commodity basic industries and then in higher end and production stage sectors. I don't see among the speakers who is now busy with political affairs our Deputy Minister for Africa and Arab States, Mr. Bogdanov. Let me express my personal opinion on future development of Russia and Africa. To my regret, despite the effort of those who have been showing opportunities and possibilities for Africa. After 1990s, Russia almost quit Africa. When Russian leaders changed their mind and began to pay attention, to give attention to Africa, it's much more difficult to come back. For Russia to come back to Africa, and we do understand this should be done in a very serious fashion. We have not only our common positive past, the joint fight against colonialism and neo-colonialism, we have joined in common economic potential and opportunities for joint development of the mining industry, of the oil industry. Africa does need a rapid growth of food production. Russia has the capacity to develop a fertilizer, new agricultural technology development in Africa. A great role will be played in the developing healthcare. The middle class in Africa will grow numerically and its social weight will grow. Russia has shown and proved that it can be Africa's partner in developing healthcare capacity. And some high-tech opportunities are there. The first nuclear power station is being built in Africa, in Egypt. It shows that we can cooperate in this sector, and Africa will be provided with its own energy resources. Today, its capacity is underutilized, from solar power to traditional, conventional energy resources. Russia has all of this, and we can have and find potential for cooperation as well. I can talk for long about the future issues and opportunities. Let me say it again. I'm not an optimist or super optimist for the near future. Africa faces difficult times. But look at the recent past. Congo, huge African countries, former Belgian Congo, gained its independence. And the leader of the movement, Patrice Lumumba, was treacherously murdered by the colonialists. But when, at that time, this huge country had less than 10 people having higher university education. Fewer than 10 people in Congo, Africans, had university education at that time. Today, the issues facing that country are known. In Congo alone, every year, tens of thousands of people get university education, graduate from university. That's the kind of development that has taken place, despite all the losses that country were incurred, although it was called the World African War, when millions of people were killed. I can cite other cases of successful development from Ghana to Seychelles. This recent epoch shows that we should be optimists with regard to Africa's future. And this is the basis for our attitude to African affairs. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Victor. Now let me give the floor to the ambassador of the Republic of Senegal, Jean-Baptiste Tiatitin. Your Excellency, welcome. Would be happy to hear your opinion on the agenda.
Merci, bonjour. Monsieur le recteur, monsieur le représentant du vice-ministre Bogdanov, je ne l'ai pas vu. Excellences, messieurs les ambassadeurs, chers collègues, chers participants. Avec un thème pareil, c'est-à-dire l'Afrique
Африка
dans un monde en mutation,
в меняющемся мире
difficile d'intervenir
становится ей тяжело. Мне тяжело выступать после таких блестящих выступивших, но постараюсь все-таки добавить от себя немножко важного для раскрытия этой темы. Я с большим удовольствием принял это приглашение в рамках 24-го заседания Академической международной конференции ЕСИН, организованной Высшей школой экономики Национального института исследований об экономическом и социальном развитии. Хотел бы вас благодарить и вас поздравить, выражая радость встретить в этом университете, который является очагом мысли и речи. Выбранная тема является центральной для Африки, в частности, в области, показывающей созревание и твердое желание интегрироваться в экономику и посвятить себя Африка – это самый большой континент. У меня тоже мигает почему-то.
Прошу сказать по готовности английский дорожный.
А вот только на английском я слышу, на французском не переключайся.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Все? Вот опять замигал.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you hear us in English?
Donc c'est le plus grand continent en termes de superficie avec 30 millions de kilomètres carrés. C'est aussi 54 États. Ça veut dire 54 États, c'est de la diversité, c'est une force et une faiblesse. À l'intérieur, on peut y loger les États-Unis, on peut y loger la Chine, l'Inde et une partie de l'Europe occidentale. Ils auront de la place. Aujourd'hui, l'Afrique est peuplée. À peu près 1 milliard de personnes, avec un taux de croissance démographique de 2,6%.
Африка – это континент, в котором составляет 30 миллионов квадратных. Africa is a continent that has 30 million square kilometers and has 24 states. And
3 languages is a challenge for us.
the population of Africa is about 1 million people with demographic growth, population growth rate of 2.6%. And in mid-century, Africa will have 2.2 billion people and will account for 1/4 of the global population.
Nous avons beaucoup de ressources minières et énergétiques dont les 9 dixièmes ne sont pas encore exploités.
The continent has 1/4 the global territory, and 60% of the arable lands of the world.
Alors, quelle peut être sa place?
And actually, economic growth since 2000 is going to be more than 5%. Based on these advantages and assets, we can be a priority partner in all sectors. Mineral resource development, agriculture, population, workforce, to occupy such place and position. There are three, at least, conditions for us to play this role. Number one is development, economic development and social development. The second is stability and security. And finally, the third condition or precondition is organizational. Integration, regional and continental. And we expect from our partners in the world, including Russia, support and expressed partnership to support the regions of Africa and assist the African Union in its effective operation across the continent. And this integration envisages a project in keeping with Agenda 2063 of the African Union, including specific areas like railway transport development and high-speed trains. And it's important to see and have agricultural development. Let me tell you this, if Russia expressed its direct intent to take part in the implementation of these plans going forward to 2063, this would create some competitive desires on the part of other countries for them to be involved. And let me conclude by saying that Africa should take a priority place in this wide cooperation based on integration and security. We are looking forward to have partners as Russia to meet the goals set for 2063. And thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. We will do that. We'll make it. For us to have more time and for discussions, let me give the floor to an outstanding scholar, Vladimir Shubin, who is known across Africa. Vladimir Shubin, Institute of Africa of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dear colleagues, dear friends, let me be brief, although the topic, the agenda of this event is very broad and wide. Let me start by saying, quite often people say about the emergence of the multipolar, multicentric world, the discussion on which goes beyond this agenda. I don't share all of these opinions, but I insist that this multipolar world has been in existence since mid-1960s. since the time when, unfortunately, the Soviet Union quarreled with China or the other way around. Therefore, we should talk not about the formation, but the continuation and further development and protection of the defense of the multipolar world. Even in the early 1960s, when the policies of our so-called leadership of Yeltsin and Kozyrev was absolutely pro-Western, the world was not unipolar, even at that time. Look at Somalia, where the United States had to withdraw their troops in the early 1990s. That's my number one point. There is this other aspect and matter, non-alignment. I will speak South Africa. Comrade Lindiwe Sisulu spoke about non-alignment. Let me remind you that the movement of non-alignment, or positive neutrality as was called, initially it triggered and caused some attacks by Western countries. John Foster Dulles, State Secretary of the United States at that time, a moral and short-sighted conception of neutralism, end of quote. It's important to recall this, where African, and not only African countries, are trying to, are being driven, rather, into conflicts with Russia. Let me remind you, there is no isolation for Russia. If I am to joke, the Finns isolated themselves from the possibility of drinking cheap vodka in St. Petersburg. They isolated this from this opportunity. No African country ever used sanctions against Russia. No Latin American countries, no Caribbean country except Bahamas. Bahamas are distinct. They had King Charles, whom we call Karl. They had him as the head state, or closer to New Zealand and Australia than to Latin America.
So, therefore, we can safely say that the sanctions are a nuisance. And, of course, they are unsuccessful. Look at Moscow and just walk down the street. Russia has been coping quite well, but the real danger of sanctions is that there is a lack of information about Russia in Africa and about African countries in Russia. And it's just not the lack of information that is a problem. There's a lot of misinformation flying around. And maybe South Africa is an exception here, because almost all of the newspapers are against its own government, and it's probably the only country in the world. Sorry for interfering with your domestic affairs, but I keep telling my students, don't study the history or the situation in South Africa by just looking at that country's newspaper, because you will get a skewed type of information. Since I don't have a lot of time, I would like to make a couple of points of just something to think about. The Russian scholars have this tendency to be Eurocentrist. Okay, we're reading here that the African states are still in the process of initial stages of modernization and statehood development. Well, let's talk about urbanization. Well, whether this is good or not, that's something that can be debated. But to say that 60 years after becoming independent, they are still in the initial stages of statehood, I think that's very Eurocentric, that's really something that can be debated. And another question that also is a cause for debate, we're talking about stabilization, but do we always need stabilization? Russia was quite stable for 300 years. And in 1913, the Romanov celebrated the 300th anniversary of its reign. Remember what happened? And our country was quite stable until 1991, and then what happened after that? So we should also discuss what are the risks of stabilization, the risks that threaten stabilization, but the stabilization itself can pose certain risks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Shubin. You were, as always, brief, but with a good sense of humor. Okay, we're a little bit behind our schedule, but hopefully we're going to be able to catch up and we'll be able to go to lunch on time. Please allow me to give the floor to Ms. Al-Sayed Izzat Saad, Director of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. We would be very happy to hear your report and hear about the future of Africa from the perspective of a practitioner, because Dr. Al-Sayed is the PhD in International Law and Ambassador Extraordinary Plenipotentiary of the Arab Republic of Egypt here. The floor is yours.
The organizing committee for the hospitality and the warm reception. I admire the intervention of my previous speaker. It was a great thing. Views regarding the African continent are usually divided between a pessimistic point of view that views the continent with its multiple problems and crises as a lost cause, and another point of view that is optimistic about a promising future for the continent and its population. In fact, each point of view has arguments supporting it. With all the enormous challenges, there is still hope for a prosperous Africa that provides promising opportunities for its nationals and its partners at the same time. In 2022 alone, African partnership summits were held with the European Union, Turkey, Japan, and the United States. In July this year, the second Russian-African summit will be held, and I think, in my opinion, this is the third summit because in 2011, I remember that Professor Alexei Vasilyev succeeded in organizing the first Russia-Africa forum, business forum. And I remember I participated in the preparation of that business forum, so I consider it the first Africa-Russia summit, and then the second was in 2019, and the third will be in July this year. Ladies and gentlemen, there are a number of considerations that give rise to cautious optimism about a promising future for Africa, and I think some of my previous speakers mentioned that in their interventions. It is acceptable to say that the global competition for Africa began decades ago, and even as early as the post-decolonization era. In the midst of the Cold War, the main objective of the Western Alliance was to fight communism, and it was not preoccupied with the issue of developing or helping the countries of the continent. This was embodied in the silence of the United States on the rule of the white minority in South Africa and in southern Rhodesia, along with enormous American interventions in the affairs of the continent under the pretext of fighting communism. Let us not forget in this regard that Ronald Reagan, whose policy towards Africa was characterized by cynicism and indifference, condemned the economic sanctions that most countries of the world were calling for against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis in Ukraine came to contribute to the transformation of the continent into a new arena for competition and even an arena for settling the scores with major powers involved in the crisis, which was reflected in the divergence of African positions on the crisis since its outbreak. Perhaps the most important lesson learned from this African position is that Africa may have finally decided to reshape and reformulate its role on the international arena in the next stage, in light of the growing international interest in obtaining its wealth, and it has realized that the existing international order doesn't take into account the interests, and that what is going on in Ukraine is not really its own battle. I would say one of the strategic shifts in connection with the crisis in Ukraine was, of course, the expansion of Russian influence in Africa, and there is a popular welcome to the Russian presence in many countries in the continent. And of course, I fully agree with Professor Vasiliev in emphasizing the lot of opportunities for Russia to enhance its economic presence in Africa, especially in the basic sectors, including the energy sector, in addition to its political and security presence. Russia will have to make efforts to increase its direct investments in the continent, as well as to develop its economic cooperation and increase the volume of its trade exchange with the continent in line with its growing political and security influence in the continent. The crisis in Ukraine may carry with it a package of opportunities for the African continent if they succeed in exploiting them in their favor at the expense of the opportunism of Western countries that extended over the past long decades. African countries are skeptical regarding the credibility of the American initiatives to support it, which remain modest and unable to meet the growing development needs of more than 50 African countries. Most of these contributions are also subject to congressional approval. There are no guarantees that these initiatives will continue or be funded in the event of a change in the administration in the White House or the partisan majority in the Congress. On the other hand, there is an opportunity for the continent to enhance its position in the global order, including international institutions, amid predictions of important strategic shifts in the structure of the international order during the next stage, so that Africa will not always be an arena of international competition among the major powers that have been draining its resources and wealth for centuries. There is no doubt that Russian and also Chinese realism represent a kind of comparative advantage for them versus the United States, which always links its economic plans and investment to political considerations, which is what makes the African partner skeptical about the usefulness of the American approach and the transformation of its pledges from more promises into actual projects and programs on the ground. The United States and its allies must realize the impossibility of shaping the world in the Western image and recognize that there are many multilateral frameworks that exist today, embodying different levels of consensus on the standards and the rules of conduct of the state and its domestic, economic, and political choices. This reality testifies to the rapid erosion of the global order that is dominated by the West. It has to be noted that the concept of the foreign policy of the Russian Federation, approved by President Putin in March 31st last, is emphasizing, among other elements, the importance of cooperating with the African states, and I quote, in their desire for a more equitable, polycentric world and the elimination of social and economic inequality. Finally, Africans can view the current geopolitical crisis as an opportunity to reduce their country's dependence on food imports from outside the continent and to accelerate the implementation of many agricultural projects in cooperation with international entities by taking advantage of the vast arable areas amounting to about 60% of the total arable land in the world in order to achieve self-sufficiency in food and export to the global market in order to achieve food security for the continent during the coming period. I thank you.
Thank you very much for such a substantive intervention. Please allow me to now give the floor to a very experienced expert who is a frequent guest in Moscow. We have been working with Mr. Maharaj for a long time as part of BRICS and in other areas. We are happy to welcome him to the Higher School of Economics. Please allow me to give the floor to Director General of the Institute for Economic Research and Innovation at the Technical University of Tshwane, and our good friend, dear Mr. Rasigan Maharaj.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks to all the colleagues who have spoken before. I know we're chasing time, so if it's okay, I'll skip past the protocol elements and get into the substance. Yeah. So, in responding to what some of the colleagues have also raised, I think up front I should state my optimism is driven by my pessimism. So it's quite important that we actually embrace the negative situation we are in to allow us or afford us the opportunity to grasp onto something more positive itself. So as of Monday this week, the African population is 1.428 billion. Mathematically, this is 16.72% of the world's population. The reason I'm raising these issues at that level of specificity is we have differences. And how is it that we, a continent, have differences in even understanding who lives on it? And this is quite a challenge for us in terms of how data about Africa is generated. And then we become subject to the machinations or the manipulation of that data itself. So colleagues also encourage us to be much more critical about how we use concepts. So throwing around concepts like human capital locks us into a particular discourse. And I would encourage a more critical appreciation of what these concepts do in terms of constraining possibilities available to us. This is very significant in terms of how the narrative around development is not only shaped, but hegemony is maintained and reproduced as well. So I won't give you, when you read the text itself, you'll see the data that's presented, in terms of what we best know about the continent. But I want us to note, remember, 16.72% of the world's population. In 2022, the IMF estimated that the global economy produced 104 trillion US dollars. All of Africa, 16.72% of the world, was estimated by the IMF only to have contributed 2.1%. Yeah? So this uneven distribution of productive capacities and capabilities across the 55 countries becomes more stark when we realize even that small percentage of contribution to the world economy came from only 4 countries, constituting more than 50%. I hope people are getting a grasp of the numbers and what they actually mean itself. This is very important to us because it shows the effects of combined and uneven development being perpetuated itself. Yeah? So while agriculture, as people have mentioned, constitutes nearly 35%, over a third of Africa's GDP, and employs, in other words, generates incomes for more than 51% of the population, we still have 123 million people, 12% of sub-Saharan Africa's population, facing acute food short insecurity. That's 2/3 of the total world population facing such a crisis. Yeah. The IMF also recognizes that Africa stands out disproportionately as the most climate vulnerable territory in world systems. While that's happening, 50% of our 1.4 billion people still do not have access to reliable supply of electricity. These are critical issues in terms of what we want to build. Africa is the continent with the largest number of developing countries, highest concentration of least developing countries in world systems. It's imperative that we realize the improvements in the relationship, as colleagues have mentioned, between demography, population size, age, natural resource endowments, and critical for us, industrialization. It is not possible that we continue in the current order of the world because we will merely reproduce it. So the 8th point I raise is we need to pay attention to the efforts being made at African integration itself. As our colleagues have mentioned earlier, we are driven by this in a post-colonial form. But while this is true, we have to be careful that neo-colonialism stalks us. And this gets embedded very much in the rhetoric that springs forth around African integration itself. The historical experience of post-colonial reconstruction and development has, as colleagues have pointed out, not advantaged the continent to the extent that the collective West has been able to extract benefits from the continent itself. So to realistically pursue what Pablo Escobar said recently, true and sovereign independence across the global South, it remains crucial to learn from our common history, as expressed, ensure deeper and wider people-to-people cooperation, collaboration, and what's critical in here is knowledge. Knowledge is the critical aspect in the reproduction of society, and attention to improving scientific and technological cooperation between us forms a bedrock for the alliance between Russia, a country, and the 55 countries of Africa itself. So we don't as yet invest 1% of our gross domestic product in research and development. It's a target. Russia already exceeds that target. Already there's a mutuality that we can build upon. As we've heard also, the positive sentiments towards the Russian Federation from the peoples of Africa derives from the legacy of Soviet Union support for struggles for national liberation, against the interests of capital based in the collective West. It's important. The political aspect, to some extent, has been surpassed or moved beyond. But the impact of transnational corporations, of capital, in terms of ensuring the longevity of the collective West, needs to continuously be challenged. Such a critical perspective affords the opportunity to question what's being posed, and we know this, so excuse me, I hope the translation comes out correct. A rules-biased Washington consensus. We didn't agree to it because we still don't know what all the rules are, but we keep being told about it. One of them, economic growth is the engine of poverty reduction. As the colleague mentioned, we've experienced in many instances plus 5% growth. Have we seen poverty reduction? Colleagues, we need to challenge these things, yes. Because this is what binds us into that logic that is not helping Africa. It's important then to continue to shape our theories from the real facts, not the rhetoric that gets spun. The investments need to be made in better understanding actual dynamics of transformation to help us actually seek the better future we want. I think collectively with Russian Federation and the peoples of Russia, peoples of Africa, we can learn together. Our shared history of resisting colonialism and struggling to construct the world we want, need and demand has afforded us much headway. Capitalizing on such accrued advantage is realizable if we choose to do so. We must be determined in what we want to see as the outcome. Yeah? So let us ensure that our progressive praxis follows our shared critique of the contemporary conjuncture in world systems and thereby contributes to a better life for all, emphasizing Russian and African peoples. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. Далее позвольте предоставить слово директору.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the director of the Center for African Studies, Andrei Maslov, Professor Maslov. We are coming closer to lunch. I'll be brief. I remember the 1st of October 1997, the Conference of Africa students, where Alexei Mikhailovich Vasilyev gave a report and paper on Africa in a changing world. I was a freshman, a first-year student. It was a window into my major. And this right name and title for this very conference, honoring and paying homage to Dr. Vasilyev's presentation at the time. Again, the mood was different in African studies. There were quite a few Africa researchers, and they were looking for jobs outside of their specialty. It's only lazy people today in Russia who is not an African expert or student, because the demand for African studies exceeds the number of opportunities and jobs. And we see that the best students are enthusiastic. There is an interest on the part of the businesses. But where were they before? Now the businesses in Russia get to be interested in opportunities for business development with Africa. This very conference and assembly is on the eve of the second Russia-Africa summit, as was noted. We should try and derive some added knowledge and value for the participants of the forthcoming summit, to have some productive outcome and result for this conference. There's little time left before this summit. More or less, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs defined the agenda. We understand sanctions, food security, requiring key significance. We should approach this summit with specific proposals, specific initiatives, ideas. I'm back from Africa. I have visited 6 countries. I came back last night. Everybody is saying the same things, specific things, specific matters. We are ready to come, but we want to discuss specific initiatives. And the specific initiatives should be born also within the expert community like ourselves. I would like to come forward with some proposals, partially based on our research, partially based on what I heard today from the esteemed speakers. I believe that one of such key ideas for the forthcoming summit should be practical steps to increase openness of Russia vis-à-vis Africa. We should enhance this openness with regard to information exchange, but not only. Easier visits, easier entry visas. Quite often it's an asymmetrical situation where it's easier for Russians to visit Africa than for Africans to visit Russia. Summits should be used to correct the situation. We need to create right conditions for having more Africans studying here, to increase the number of allowances and stipends. Not so much now extending the number, but to enhance the demand, to enhance the quality of the applicants. Today, with all due respect, it is more the best universities should train the best experts, the future opinion leaders, the future leaders and managers, as was the case in the Soviet Union. Dr. Shubin will correct me if I'm wrong. Education should be continuous, school, university, and then postgraduates, the graduates in their respective countries should be able to be retrained. Extension services in Russia for graduates. Our opponents, our competitors are doing this, are quite successful in this. And we should not just increase the number of African graduates in Russia's universities, but we should focus on the better quality. We should perhaps pool the resources that Russia is spending for a long-term program, 10 to 2 years, maybe 2 decades, to develop the human potential, investing into human potential of Africa. and maybe the content, substantive things should not only be discussed but should be proposed after their coordination and approval during the summit. Then we should extend the planning horizon. It's not just from summit to summit, not toward the end of the budget year to spend this or that amount, but we should plan for 2 decades ahead. Every dollar that we'll invest into developing relations with Africa will have multiple returns. In the past year, we have the balance of $90 billion. That's the money that Russia received into its financial system, minus African import coming from Africa. Access of any African countries not being produced in Russia should come easily into Russia. We are now carefully studying import duties. I've just visited South Africa, the Intergovernmental Commission. We talked to South African colleagues, and we see specific measures to make it easier for African commodities, goods to come to Russia. This will not damage the interests of Russian producers, and we shall be a real input and investment into our relations with Africa. And we should have specific recommendations to be developed and coordinated with Ministry of Economic Development before the summit, perhaps. And at the summit, there have been quite a few discussions about creating a fund for Africa, support for Russian projects in Africa. Let us have this $1 billion for African, like China or Western countries. This is not Russia's path and choice. Russian operators can spend this money by themselves on their own. There should be coordination. That's the key word. The problem of Russia's cooperation in Africa not liking money. The problem is very high profit expectations on the part of Russian operators due to lack of knowledge. Like Rashid Maharaj said, if we invest into knowledge, we reduce fears. If you have less fears, then you will agree for having 20% of expected profit. We should invest into better understanding of knowledge, of risk, of investment. And when our Russian banks have their own assessment of risk of investment, this will be a real assistance than just giving $1 billion. Up until now, Russian banks are using Standard & Poor's ratings. Russian government-run and owned banks. There is this moment of inertia for the situation which is no longer there, which should be overcome. And this is the role of the expert pool and communities. We should have a sovereign system of assessing country risks. Once we have it in place, trade will expand. And when we have trade in national currencies, Chinese yuan can be used for the transition period. Other friendly countries' currencies, African currencies, we should learn how to deal in them. Ruble could also be used. Then we can talk about the specific funds dedicated and the system of lending in support of experts. We could think along these lines. Investment into human capital and information should become a skeleton and backbone of our long-term investment. People and information are two pillars on which strategy should be built. So much for what I had to say. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now let me give the floor to our concluding speaker, Deputy Director of the Center for Stability and Risk Analysis, Leonid Isaev.
Vice-directeur du Centre d'études de stabilité et des risques de Chine.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, dear colleagues, guests. Myself, as a person whose life in the past over 2 decades is closely related with HSC. It gives special pleasure to see that at the main academic event, annual event, we discuss Africa. It's just unique. And I believe that we are experiencing a unique breakthrough moment. My colleague, Dr. Maslov, started with going back to the past. Let me go back to my personal experience, going back to the past. When I started my career focusing on the Middle East in the second half of 2000s, first decade of this century, I remember my colleagues, including students of Middle East, they were saying it's not the best region that was chosen. There's no future for the Middle East, they were saying. Nobody's giving attention or paying attention even to the Middle East. We should look at other regions. China, Southeastern Asia, India. Middle East is a dull region where nothing has happened and nothing is happening and will be happening. But life showed a different situation. Now we see the Middle East has become and is now a key region of the world, one of the key regions of the world. Speaking about Africa and responding to the key question that is on the title of this plenary session about the role of Africa in a changing world. The significance of Africa is going to rise. And what we've been observing for this past year is a case in point. We're seeing the global crisis, the crisis of the world order, made attention to Africa so topical.
We can see that attention to these matters at the top level has increased, and we have been seeing a lot of top-level visits there from the United States, from the European Union, from China, from Russia, all of them visiting the African continent. And we see that the importance of the African continent is really going up. And we can state that the fight for Africa didn't stop after the end of the Cold War. Russia fell out of this process for some time, but what is very clear is that we are now entering a new phase of the fight for the African continent, and the competition is going to get even more fierce. And I would follow up on my colleague Shubin introduced earlier, speaking about the crisis and stability. It is indeed true that the global crisis that we're going through right now is fraught with a lot of risks, including risks for the African countries and our colleagues who have joined us today, colleagues from Africa. They can sense that. They sense this daily pressure that is being applied and brought to bear on journalists, politicians, experts in African countries. That is indeed true. And that pressure is going to get ratcheted up even further. And at the same time, any crisis is a window of opportunities. And the world order crisis that we're witnessing today is also a window of opportunities. And We can see this happening now in the Middle East. I'm talking about the countries that are brave enough and courageous enough and yet diplomatic enough to pursue their sovereign and pragmatic foreign policy. And they are able to gain advantage out of this. They are becoming the beneficiaries of this global crisis that is happening right now. And in that context, what is happening in Africa right now is also a window of opportunity for African countries as well. An opportunity to state their, or claim their place in this world. I'm going to talk about the trends that we'll be observing in Africa or in African development. So those trends are not uniform, and this is probably one of the most diverse continents in our world. On the one hand, this is a region where there's a lot of poverty, but on the other hand, this is a region that's from the beginning of the 2000s have been showing the highest growth rates, economic growth rates. On the one hand, these are regions that are rich with mineral wealth, and on the other, this is a region that has been showing a great growth rate, which makes this fight for the resources even more topical, including the fight for these resources between the Africans, including the fight for the water resources. This is the region where, on the one hand, we see its role growing in the world, and on the other, it is the region that is under a lot of pressure from terrorist organizations that is plagued with civil wars and separatist trends and tendencies, and of course all of that brings to the fore the need to develop what Professor Vasiliev mentioned, the need to develop African-born solutions. To a degree, Africa is now facing a historic opportunity to claim its place in today's world order as an independent subject of this process. And the very last thing I wanted to bring up is that I have no doubt in my mind that those trends that we see developing in Africa will be the trends that will be shaping the world order as a whole and the world policy. And we need to be prepared for that. It's very important at the breaking point, at the tipping point, when Africa starts defining the world trends so that it doesn't become a shock for us, as the 2011 events in the Middle East were for us. They were shocking for us, and I agree with academician Vasiliev in his assessment that there cannot be any lightning speed solutions, but what we need to learn to do now is we need to learn how to understand each other, how to speak to each other. So once again, I would like to thank all of the colleagues who had come here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. Dear guests, our plenary session has come to an end. It was dedicated to Africa. Well, thank you for your active work. It was very and truly interesting and useful. Educational as well. I'm sure that the opinions expressed here will contribute to solving the problems that were outlined during the discussion, and I hope to see you again soon, and we'll have further discussions. I would like to thank all of the speakers and all of the listeners for their attention. Now we will take a group photo of the speakers, and then we will be able to continue our socializing during the lunch break. Thank you very much.